Welcome to the Glassworking shop. Well, the project is going well, parts are coming out nice, and today I'm going to be making a kind of an interesting assembly of rods using the cold assembly method. I discovered this one kind of by accident when I was just fumbling around and going, what would happen if I tried it this way? And it actually turned out to be quite nice. Here's a photo of the rods wrapped with safety wire in the little holding fixture. And the interesting part about the design is that the outer section of rods, the outer section of North Star poppy around the outside, when it's all squeezed together, it causes the inner rods to make a kind of a cool, pointy, kind of an interesting star shape. And I got a photograph showing the detail of that in one of my previous pieces. So, like I said in previous videos, I'm starting to move away from just random experimentation and starting to take some of the things I've learned when I was just trying stuff at random and seeing what happened, and now trying to apply it in a slightly more systematic way. Of course, this doesn't mean I'm going to give up just random experimentation. There's always room for that because, you know, discovering new stuff is cool. But also taking what I've learned and putting it together in a more disciplined way is also a kind of a cool thing. So I've got everything all set up. I've got my rather large punty with moil on the NQALHA preheating. It's already been gathered, everything's ready to go, and time to get to work. So I've got the assembly here, and somewhat difficult to predict. I don't actually have a good camera on this, so it's hard to see the real detail, but it's probably also not that important because I'm just heating the end of rods. But still, you know, who knows, maybe someday I'll redo my camera system. I'm not preheating the rod stack in the kiln because I've found that with manufactured color rods I can kind of get away with just heating the ends when the rods are cold. I've never had a problem doing it this way, so it actually does provide some practical benefits, like being able to hold the opposite end, being able to hold the cold end in the early stages. So I take my preheated guy out of the NQALHA, and then the battery on the wireless microphone died, so I'm going to have to try to do a voiceover on this, which is a little bit more difficult than doing it live because I can't really think of a whole lot to say when I'm just sitting here watching the video. So I'm using two hands. I'm keeping the moil hot, getting it nice and hot and really soupy while preheating the end of the rods. The rods are cold in the rod holder because they're manufactured rods. I don't feel the need to preheat them in the kiln, and it makes them a tiny little bit easier to deal with. So now I've got the moil ripping hot, and stick it on, lift it out. Then notice that I can hold it because it hasn't been preheated in the kiln. For some of my other cold assembly, I can't do that. Now I'm going over to the not over to the NQALHA. Now I'm going over to get that weld a little bit more solid because the stack of rods is pretty unstable at this point, and it's real easy for things to fall apart, especially when I start heating them in the center. So just kind of heating the outside at the weld end, and probably getting a little bit too hot on the stainless safety wire. You can see it glowing red there. Then put it in the NQALHA, let it droop a little bit to get it back on center. That's by stopping rotation. Now the next thing I need to do, having gotten the moil end somewhat better welded, now I'm going to concentrate on the open end. And I don't really want to weld the open end completely shut. I just want it to get to stick together enough that the rods don't go crazy when I release the safety wire. The reason that I don't want to weld the end solid is that there's still air pockets inside, and when I start squeezing, I want to be able to have somewhere for the air to get out. So just kind of gently on the end of the rods. The end of the rods will kind of boil and degrade a little bit. They're sharp cut off ends, and that's okay because they'll be, when this thing is pulled, they'll end up in the wasted section of the knuckle anyway. So just kind of giving it a little bit of paddle, kind of gently fusing it together, being very careful not to overheat it too much, but not quite as careful as I am when doing the main assembly. It's interesting that some YouTube video makers actually claim that it's easier to do the narration as a voiceover, and I'm finding it kind of difficult. It seems like when I'm doing the work, I actually just kind of naturally think of things to say, and now I'm kind of struggling and wondering, hey, I'm running out of things to say. So now I've got the end welded together kind of sort of well enough to take off that first piece of safety wire. It was getting a little bit hot because it was kind of close to the flame. And once again, everything in glasswork goes really slow, which is kind of one of the nice things about using the NQALHA. It makes it easy to go slow, and your hand isn't getting tired, you're not rushing, you're not getting impatient and getting bored, and your hand isn't hurting, so it's easier to let things heat up slowly. Now I'm returning to the moil end because now that weld is okay, but it's not that great. Now switching to the full mag flame and turning down the flame. You notice that I've got a fairly short candles. I'm using the mag flame not because I want a hotter flame, but because I want more surface area to be covered. And what I'm doing now is using a small oxidizing flame, a cold flame, short candles in the far flame to try to get the surface rods kind of hot enough to stick. The first step in this process is to get the surface rods hot enough where I can take them over to the squeezer and just kind of tag them in place, because if I continued heating that thing, the rods would all bulge out and get all crooked, and the core is still pretty cold. So now I'm going over to handwork on the L marver, on the torch top marver, and just kind of straightening things out a little. The rods got a tiny little bit crooked as they were being heated and starting to move around a little bit. This is a kind of a little bit of a tricky operation to try to get this done, because what I want to do is build core heat without overheating the outer rods. So now I'm just about ready, over to the squeezer and give it just the tiniest, gentlest touch, being sure to line up the outer layer of rods in the right orientation. The purpose of the first squeeze is just to tag it in place. And once it gets tagged, it's substantially more stable, and I have far less risk of the whole thing just kind of blooming apart. So the strategy that I'm trying to accomplish here, in order to make this pattern, not only do the outer rods need to be hot and soft, the inner core needs to be hot and soft as well. So now another very gentle squeeze on the squeezer, just barely touching it, almost no force at all. And primarily what I'm doing here is getting it to tag and trying to suck some heat out of the outer rods, because I'm trying to build core heat so that the core can fuse together and kind of extrude out into a kind of a little pointy pattern. And if I overheated the outside while the core was still really cold, then I just smear up the outside rods and not get the effect I'm looking for with the little points extruding into the spaces between the outer rods. So by doing it very slowly, every time I put it in the flame, I'm slowly soaking heat into the core while basically overheating the outside rods, and then putting it in the squeezer cools the outside rods and stiffens them up, but it doesn't do a thing to the core heat inside. And so by the process of a little bit of squeeze, just a kind of a gentle squeeze here, I'm not stomping on it yet, just gently squeezing and sucking the heat out of the rods, cooling them down while I build core heat in the piece. And because this operation, it does require a little bit of finesse, it does require a little bit of handwork. I was starting doing it by hand. Now I'm switching over to the NQALHA so I can kind of take a little break, get it back on center in the outer flame, and just kind of gently starting to build the core heat. I kind of go back and forth between the NQALHA and handwork depending on what's going on, depending on do I need to have the control of handwork? Am I getting tired? Do I have something that I need to do where I let the assistant take over? And it's not a rigorous rule. It's not a hard and fast rule. It's just whatever kind of feels natural at the time. And I'm heating now and noticing that it's not quite drooping yet, but as soon as it starts drooping, that way I know that I have core heat built up, and it really doesn't work really well on the unsupported single-sided lathe operation of the NQALHA once it starts drooping. So I'm just carefully observing, slowly building core heat, and just letting the machine do the work. Okay, I think I noticed it's hard to say because doing the voiceover after doing the video, it's hard to remember what I was feeling at the time. I may have noticed a bit of droop, and it's definitely a lot easier to control droop, especially when heating at the moil end. So now I'm going back over to the squeezer. This is probably going to be a pretty good squeeze. I think it's almost time now to give it a stronger squeeze. That still wasn't like the mega squeeze. That wasn't the really big stand on it and hold squeeze, but it was a little bit stronger of a squeeze. You can see the outer rods have been squashed down a little, but there's still core visible in the spaces between the outer rods. And remember that the goal that I'm trying to accomplish here is to drive out all the air, solidify the core down to the center rod, and then get the middle layer of rods to extrude out into the spaces between the outer layer of rods and form the the kind of pointy pattern. I can tell just by looking at the way it's behaving on the video that it's starting to get loose in the center. And I think I'm going to start doing I'm standing on the squeezer now and giving it the full squeezing force, because when it started drooping, that was my hint, my clue that, well, okay, there's heat in the core is softened, and now it's time to start getting aggressive and start fusing the core together and try to get the core to extrude outward. Now, when heating this piece, it's really important to get the heat uniform, and getting the heat uniform on a piece like that is not as straightforward as one might imagine. The far end, that's open to the air, tends to lose its heat because it's open to the air. The other end that's on the punty and the moil is losing its heat because it's connected to a heat sink. So I have to be preferentially heating, putting more heat than you would imagine is necessary, concentrating on the end, concentrating on both ends, and kind of letting the middle take care of itself. So I'm kind of going back and forth. Now I'm working on the moil end, now I'm working on the open end, and trying to get a uniform heat into the piece by preferentially heating one or the other side. Now here comes another, lining it up carefully to make sure the pattern is correct, and then standing on the squeezer and holding it for a little while, because sometimes the core moves really slowly, even though the outside is totally solidified by contact with the cold graphite dies. The core still retains its heat, and sometimes standing on the squeezer for a fairly long time it actually helps to consolidate the whole thing and get it to stick together. So little bit by little bit, I still have some space in between the outer rods. Every time the thing goes in the squeezer, the outside surface of the outer rods are cooled and the core heat remains, so I can continue building core heat without overheating the outside. Once again, now I'm concentrating the heat on the open end, because the open end is actually the trickier end. The moil, I mean, they're both tricky. The moil end is tricky because when you start heating it there, the piece gets unstable and starts flopping around, and the open end is trouble because it's open, and it seems probably a little more troublesome on the open end. I have to pay a little more attention on the open end. So now another squeeze, standing on the squeezer, and you could almost see the dies move a little bit in that shot. They're not moving very much. As I've said in other videos, and you can see now that a hexagon has been formed, and it looks like everything is now consolidated and formed into a solid piece. And the next operations are going to be to round it off. I'm probably going to add maybe, I don't remember what I did. I have to wait for it to come up in the video. Okay, here it goes, back into the squeezer again to try to get the moil end a little bit more under control, because I noticed something funny going on the moil end. And the next step after consolidating the whole thing into a solid is going to be to round it out. And I think I remembered that I actually used the squeezer a little bit in the rounding process, but most of the rounding process is done by hand using the L-marver, and it's all done just slow and gentle because the colors that I'm using are sensitive. It's very easy to boil them. It's very easy to overheat them, and that's why I'm using the short candle, highly oxidizing flame, plenty of blue knob on the Delta Mag on the GTT, and just gently getting that heat in there. just paying attention to how it feels, paying attention to how it looks, and just trying to keep the whole thing straight and under control. This is a slow process, and just to take a little detour into philosophy for a moment about why I do the videos the way I do them, it's very tempting, especially when I'm doing a voiceover and running out of things to say, it's very, very tempting to imagine, well, why not just speed it up? You know, I can go into my video editor and just run it at 5 times speed, and it won't be quite as boring, and it'll be actually a little more interesting to watch for the casual viewer. But for someone who is using this to try to learn about glasswork, real time is important. Timing is important. It's important to get a feel for how long things take. And glasswork does take a really long time. When I first started learning glasswork and I watched videos that were shot in real time or watched glassworkers in real time, it just amazed me how long it took and how little got done. It was just, you know, lots of time, very small amount of progress. And then when I actually started doing the work and started overheating colors, started boiling colors, getting degradation, getting the glass overworked, I realized, oh yeah, that's why they do it so slow. So just very gently now, spinning by hand. Yeah, there's a chance this could be done on the NQALHA, but it does require a tiny bit more finesse, a little bit more hand skill, and so I do it by hand, even though it's a kind of a long, boring process. And who knows, maybe one of these days I'll figure out a way to do it on the NQALHA. The problem with the NQALHA doing this kind of work, where the piece is slightly loose and slightly unstable, that even though the NQALHA, oh, here we go back to the squeezer, we're just going to kind of like touch it a little bit, touch and rotate. Actually, no, I'm not touching, I'm standing on it. Boy, I don't remember anything about these videos. I must have noticed something there that I didn't like, that it thought that it needed a little more consolidation. But normally by this time in the process, it's all about rounding out the corners of the hexagon. So even though I did this work, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, I've forgotten almost all the details. It's like I'm watching the video for the first time and trying to figure out, what's that guy doing? But early on in the development of the NQALHA, there was a lot of talk about, well, how do you, what's a good strategy to control droop on a piece, because it is a single-sided lathe. And if you're doing a longish piece that starts getting really loose, well, how do you control droop, and how do you control twist? And one of the early suggestions made by one of my collaborators was, well, why not just just reverse the direction? And of course, stepper motors can reverse direction pretty darn fast, probably even faster than you can do it by hand. But for some reason, it never did work right. There's some subtlety of handwork that a glassworker develops when controlling droop that, at least at the moment, I've been unable to achieve on the NQALHA. So when it comes to dealing with a very loose kind of drooping piece, so now I'm gonna work on that troublesome end with the paddle. When it comes to dealing with a very loose drooping piece, it's definitely better to do it by hand. So you can probably see that the center of the piece is pretty much all rounded out. There's no gaps. And now I'm starting to seriously work on the end, flattening it out a little bit. And it takes a lot longer to get the end right than you would imagine if you were just kind of thinking about it and not actually doing it, and just thinking, oh yeah, you got to get it a little hotter. But actually it takes it takes quite a lot of work and quite a lot of time in the flame to get that end finely smooth and solidified. And like I said, it's a slow process, so getting a little bit more of a flattening on the end, then starting to work on the other end, on the moil end, which is also troublesome and difficult. And of course, this one is extra troublesome and difficult because any heating at that point just makes it droop more, makes it more out of control. So it requires more and more increasing amount of hand skill to keep the thing under control. I am trying to avoid twist. It's not ultra critical. The piece, it's going to be cut into slices, and so controlling twist is not an absolute requirement, but I try to control twist whenever I can, just to practice keeping things straight, because there are times when controlling twist is very important. So now I switch to the Mirage flame, once again with very oxidizing flame, very short candles, to try to focus some of the heat on that troublesome joint at the moil end, and turning up the flame a little bit. And that's one thing, when working with sensitive colors, it's important to understand that cold glass is an insulator, but as glass gets hotter, heat travels better. The glass becomes a better conductor of heat as the glass gets hotter. And so when you first apply heat to a cold, sensitive rod, it's really easy to overheat the surface because the heat isn't flowing into the core. The heat is staying on the surface because the rod is an insulator. And so when you first apply heat, it's very easy to overheat the surface and cause boiling and degradation. Once the core heat has been built up in these sensitive colors, there's more conductivity going on. The heat flows a little bit more away from the surface and into the center of the piece. And so once the piece has come to working temperature, it's possible to use a little bit more aggressive of a flame without boiling or degrading the sensitive colors. So getting fairly close here. It's almost round. Doesn't need to be perfectly round, because the next step is going to be to stripe it, and it doesn't need to be absolutely flawlessly presentation grade. This is the star of the show round, but it's nice to kind of make it reasonably round, more or less round. So just nearing the final stages, headed for the last roundup, as they say in, I think that was a country song, headed for the last roundup. So just trying to get that last little bit of, you think you can see there the little gaps on the end. This piece is going to be the second core. In a previous video, I made another, what I called a core piece. So I had a core with a set of rods wrapped around it, pulled down into a cane, and then that will be cut into 6 pieces and used to fill in the divots in the hexagon pattern. This will end up being the center core of the main hexagon. So there are 2 videos where I describe making a core, and this is the main core of the hexagon. So it's nearing completion now. You can almost feel the excitement building, or maybe not. Maybe it's not exciting at all. And of course, as I was watching the video without sound, I was thinking, I don't know, maybe I should just speed it up. But it is kind of important for anyone who's using this for education, if anybody is. It's important to see what the real timing is. So I think I'm just about ready to call it macaroni. So I'm going to put it into the NQALHA, clamp it down, may or may not try to get it back on center. Doesn't really need, yeah, I'm going to stick it out a little bit more and just kind of like tap it back on center. Doesn't absolutely need to be on center for this next operation, but always nice just to practice working with it centered. So now I'm going to put it into striping position and flip it into positioning mode. In positioning mode, when the foot pedal is not pressed, the piece is not rotating. It's just held in place. It's a work holding device. And now I'm getting everything ready, getting my rod holder, getting my star white rod ready, and probably talking to the camera here. Probably had something interesting to say that I can't remember what it is I was talking about. And then while I'm talking and can't remember what I'm talking about, I'm letting that piece get cold, which is kind of important when striping, because the piece that you're striping onto needs to be hot enough for the stripe to stick. But if the piece that you're striping onto is too hot and your striping rod may be a little bit too cold, well then, now I'm tapping it to make sure that it's nice and stiff. Then you'll end up pushing divots into the core, and what I want to do is preserve the roundness and then lay down a kind of a uniform stripe over the surface. Now I'm adjusting the torch to try to get the similar kind of short candle oxidizing flame, and then here's a close-up view showing what's going on. Almost all of the flame is being directed at the striping rod, which kind of serves to preheat the rod so that by the time it gets onto the surface of the cylinder down below, it's nice and liquid. So almost all the heat is going onto the rod. A very little bit of radiant heat spillover. The edge of the flame is keeping the substrate hot, but most of the flame is going onto the striping rod. And I'm just trying to be very careful and get that nubbin under control, trying to be very careful to not press too hard on the striping rod, make sure that the glass is nice and liquid and is flowing nicely, make sure there's enough heat in the neighboring stripe so that the two stripes fuse together and that I have a nice clean weld in between them. And also check to make sure that I'm not overheating and boiling and destroying the surface of the striping rod. Now, I know I've said this many times on other videos. I really like this method of striping with a hand torch on the NQALHA. It feels like welding. I'm a welder. It feels intuitive. It feels natural to me. And I recommend that all NQALHA users give it a try and just see if you like it. It may seem foreign at first, but at least as far as I'm concerned, this is a really superior way to do it. The traditional method of striping, where you hold the workpiece in one hand, the striping rod in the other hand, and use a bench torch, feels odd to me. I can do it, but it feels odd. It feels like clamping a paintbrush in a vise and moving the canvas to paint a painting. And of course I realize that just about every other murrine maker uses the traditional method and gets excellent results, amazingly excellent results. So obviously the bench torch method does work, but I suggest that, yeah, you know, there is an alternative, and try it. You might like it. So just switched over to the rod holder. I have noticed that at least, I think, I don't know, I forget how many, but at least one, maybe more of my teachers has suggested that, well, you should be rotating the rod, twisting the rod to more uniformly heat it while striping. And I haven't developed that skill yet. I think that actually is a hand skill that requires development. But of course, you know, I'm an inventor. I'm a somewhat crazy inventor. I'm thinking, well, if I'm using a rod holder, why not just put a motor on it? So one of these days I may try a motorized rod holder and see if it actually makes any difference. Of course, I've seen other very, very proficient and talented marine makers who stripe exactly this way with a non-moving rod and get excellent results. And so I suspect that both methods are usable and acceptable, but it might be fun to try the rotating rod, get more uniform heat, maybe a little bit less chance of degradation. So just one after another, just putting down a stripe, trying to maintain uniform thickness, trying to keep the glass under control, trying not to overheat the glass, occasionally moving the torch flame around if I see signs of something happening. Now I pushed a foot pedal. Oh, nope. I think I'm going to go get another glass rod. Right when I was going to say I'm going to push the foot pedal. So just preheating another rod. Getting ready to stripe. Starting off a new rod is always a little bit challenging. I got a kind of a slightly more bulbous end on that than I would have liked, but it's no problem. It'll all work out. Once again, just focusing the flame, moving the torch around a little bit. Kind of hard to see in the video when I'm moving it side to side, but I am moving around just a little bit to get a little bit of variation in the heat. And then push the foot pedal, move a little bit. When I first designed the software for the NQALHA, I tried putting in programmed step moves where you would program in and say, oh, move 10 degrees every time you push the foot pedal. And that proved to be way too troublesome, so that's all been eliminated. And now every time you push the foot pedal, it moves, release, and it stops moving. So you just kind of like, whoop, just do it by eye. So getting very close to the end here of striping, and I'm starting to get better at striping. The stripes are coming out straighter, more parallel, more uniform. Still haven't totally mastered the trick of avoiding that little tail at the end. I'm not sure it matters for the work I'm doing. The work actually turns out just fine, but when I've watched the better marine artists, it seems like they've just got the magic little flick at the end that just keeps that last little nubbin from doing what that guy just did. So I think this might be the last stripe. The striping is moderately uniform. There's always room for improvement. I always wish I could do better, but it's the piece, when it was finished, it actually did come out more or less uniform when everything is all rounded out. So now I'm returning the NQALHA to rotation mode and putting it back in the flame and concentrating in particular on the moil end for two reasons. First of all those little nubbins back there, all that is acute angles. And if the thing is going to crack, it's going to crack at that point. Second of all, the moil has been getting cold. And just even if it wasn't for the nubbins, I want to make sure that moil is hot and happy. So I'm trying to get enough heat into that end to knock off the nubbins and get the moil hot and happy. But if I get too much heat in, then it becomes unstable and starts drooping out of control. So it's a kind of a balance to first put it in the flame immediately after striping, put it in the flame with a somewhat more aggressive flame, because I'm trying to get the surface hot without losing the stability of the core, so that I can knock off those little nubbins a bit. And so I'm using a little bit more aggressive flame. Now I noticed some droop, noticed that it was getting a tiny bit out of control, so I switched over to the far end. And now I'm just going to start at the far end and very, very slowly just round it up, round it out. And I'm going to start the roundup process on the NQALHA and continue until it starts becoming unstable as it gets closer to the moil end, and then switch to handwork. And you can probably see that most of the stripes are pretty uniform. I have one kind of outlaw stripe that's a little bit more protuberant than I would have liked, but hey, you know, it's never perfect. So just kind of gently, I've been trying to learn to use the technique of having the paddle under the flame, so the paddle isn't actually in the flame, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Still trying to get used to it. The more natural method for me is to use the paddle on top and back of the part where the paddle is like fully in the flame, which of course degrades the paddle, and I have to continually either sand or replace the graphite. So I'm just starting from the far end and rounding it up, using a slightly more aggressive flame than I did for making the core. The star white is not quite as sensitive as the colors that I used inside the core, and I find that I can use a little more aggressive flame, get a little bit closer to the flame, but still, none of these colors are totally resistant to everything. You got to be careful with all of them, but the star white is nowhere near as bad as something like cherry red, which is really sensitive and really difficult to work with and easy to overheat. So, yeah, boy, I'm getting bored watching this, so hope I don't run out of things to say. It's a slow process. But at the end, the results come out nice. There I'm using the paddle on the top. This seems to feel more natural to me, but it does put the paddle face right in the torch flame. And now I've managed to introduce a little bit of twist, because as this thing is being heated, it's becoming a tiny bit unstable. And the challenge in this kind of working with hot glass, is to keep it right on the edge of, got to be hot enough on the outside to fuse, but still cold enough on the inside to more or less maintain stability. Now I'm reversing direction there to try to control twist. I noticed that every time I touch it with the paddle, the friction with the paddle tends to introduce a tiny bit of twist, and stopping and, or actually reversing direction helps to control the twist. But it still takes some skill to do it, and it still is a rather difficult, reversing direction again, it's still a rather difficult process on a single-sided machine like this to fully control twist. Of course, even if it was a double-sided machine even on a full-size glass lathe with chucks on both sides, it's still possible to introduce a twist, except the twist is introduced in the middle. So there is no perfect, easy solution to this problem. It's just all about being aware of what's going on, and as soon as you see it twisting a little bit, kind of do something about it and don't let it get out of control. So that may be about as far as I'm going to go on the NQALHA, and then just finish it up with handwork, because when it starts getting droopy, working on the moil end, it seems like easy and intuitive. You can see how it's drooping in the video here. It seems easy and intuitive to control it by hand, but trying to do that, even though the NQALHA has very fast reverse capability, trying to do this kind of a move on the NQALHA, I haven't been able to do it. Who knows, maybe somebody can do it, but it definitely seems a bit easier to do by hand. So now, just rounding it up, making the way all the way to the end. I did extend the stripes a little bit beyond the core that I was striping over, so knowing that I'm going to get a bit of a knuckle and a bit of wasted glass, making the knuckle bigger and stronger and more well reinforced kind of gives the whole thing a little more stability, and that way I know that I don't have to try to get the last little bit of knuckle out, because the last little bit, there's nothing there anyway. It's just stripe ends over clear. So this is approaching, it's kind of looking like it's shiny, which is something that you always want to see in nicely melted in glass. You got a kind of a shiny surface, free of bubbles, starting to get a little bit of droopiness in the core. It's not super limp yet. It's not super hard to control, but starting from this amount of core heat will be a nice benefit when the next step I go to pull it down. And I'm not going to pull it down into, oh, here comes, there it is. They're ready for the close-up. It's round and more or less uniform and looking good. So the piece now has a reasonable amount of core heat inside, and I'm going to put it on the NQALHA, kind of get it back on center a tiny bit in preparation for the pull. It's one of the nice things about the NQALHA. You can just hand it off to the assistant, let the assistant keep it warm, and then go over to the kiln and grab the next piece, where I've already got a pre-made gather on the end of I think it's like a 15 millimeter rod. I forget which rod that is. It's probably a 15 millimeter rod with a gather on the end that's been preheating in the kiln. And meanwhile, I'm using the far flame of the NQALHA to keep the moil end of the piece hot, because it's important to keep both ends hot, and I'm going to be heating the far end as I stick on the puller. So I want to make sure that I get plenty of heat into the moil end so it doesn't get cold when I switch over to heating the far end in preparation for sticking. In this operation, the goal is to get the gather on the end of the puller rod ripping hot. I mean really, really hot, and get the piece that I'm sticking to hot enough to stick, but not so hot that I start degrading my pattern for any more than the first fraction of an inch. So now I'm sticking, going to be angling the rod a little bit as I kind of like push it in and maneuver it around, going over to the marver, lining it all up so that it makes a nice clean joint, going back over to the moil end, because I just spent a lot of time pumping heat into the open end and I don't want the other end to get cold. And now I'm going to start preparing for the pull. I'm imagining that it could be possible to pull on the NQALHA And I've done some very preliminary experiments doing that with mixed results. But for this piece, I'm just primarily interested in getting a usable piece. And so I'm going to pretty much revert to what I know, which is hand pulling. And once again, concentrating the heat on the ends, because if you're planning on pulling a piece of glass, the important part is that a piece be uniformly heated. And it's very easy for the inexperienced glassworker to overheat the center and underheat the ends. And so when you pull it, you end up with two giant knuckles and a strand of spaghetti. That's the easiest thing to do if you don't know what you're doing when you're pulling. So what I'm trying to do here is preferential heating to give it a little bit of extra heat. Move the NQALHA out of the way and totally shift to handwork here. Giving it extra heat on the ends and pretty much letting the middle take care of itself. So I'm mostly focusing on the ends, going back and forth from end to end, occasionally stopping in the middle, but mostly focusing on the ends, because even if you think you're getting the ends hot enough, they probably still aren't hot enough. It's still probably because they have those big heat sinks on them. The glass rods are drawing the heat out of the ends. It's still very easy to let the ends get too cold. So just very gently building the core heat, starting to feel as the piece gets softer and softer. Trying to keep the two sides in line. My handwork technique is not as good as I'd like it to be, and seeing it on the video makes me think, oh, I need to work on that, because the rods aren't parallel, or they aren't collinear, I should say. So a little bit, it's starting to, even though I'm not pulling, it's starting to kind of pull on its own. So now I'm taking it out of the flame, letting it rest for a moment, letting it equalize, and very, very gently pulling. This is not going to be pulled down to a small size. This is going to be pulled down to, I think it was about 5/8 of an inch, if I remember correctly. So kind of blow on the center to establish, oh, I got a tiny little bit of a bump in the center, which was a result of non-uniform heating, but it's not a problem. Somewhat easy to correct. So now I've got, as you can see here, I've got very little knuckle. I've got a bigger knuckle on the end that it was built from, which is okay because much of that is waste. I've got a smaller knuckle on the puller end. So now I'm gonna just kind of work a little bit on the far end in preparation for cutting it off with diamond shears. Going to just focus the heat on that puller end knuckle. Just try to get it just a little bit more usable material, knowing that the extreme end isn't that good anyway. And so I don't need to pull it down to absolutely zero knuckle, but I like to kind of get as much usable material as I can. And then kind of like heating up the puller moil and getting ready here to grab the diamond shears and just cut that guy off. And there we go. So that's about as good as it gets. Goes into the kiln. Do a little bit of cleanup in the shop. I do reuse my pullers and punties and moils and just get that guy into the torch flame so it can be rounded out for the next one, and then make my final farewell spiel that's totally out of sync with my overdubbed vocals. And just like always, thank you for watching. It's been fun.